Um, all right, both visible and audible. Okay, that's great. Then I didn't pronounce it he, him, and I take my POIs verbally. Thank you. Then I'll start my speech. Okay, so what is a post-conflict state, right? It's where open warfare has pretty much come to an end, and the previous regime most likely got either beat back or overthrown. The last government was most likely either a incompetent or be a dictator that was overthrown. So they either fell from an external invasion or an internal revolution. And we think an important piece of characterization on our side is that post-conflict states and what they uniquely need, right? In a state of shambles, political instability, the people need a person to follow. For example, if we look at history with Germany in World War I, right? They need a moral support guild and guidance that promises them hope because the country has been utterly decimated by one of the threats I've aforementioned, right? This is exactly how people are incentivized to buy into ludicrous narratives offered to them, such as the Nazis, right? And that is why it's uniquely terrible, something we are basing our case around. The stakeholders we like to analyze are most likely the citizens of the state, as this is a motion post-conflict states, and the burden and metric we like to set ourselves and come back to in the reply are that which side benefits the states in rebuilding, as that is the priority of the state due to their military, economy, and just infrastructure being in absolute shambles. Given this characterization, what are the two pieces of substantive I'd like to offer? First of all, there's a reason that the previous regime was taken down, and I'd like to explain how it potentially endangers the country if we allow for a member, perhaps in relation to the previous incompetent ruler / dictator to come into power. Our second point is how this would lead to less trust in the government and less opt-in on a macro scale from other countries. And thirdly, a principal point about how this is unjust to put a country into more turmoil, which I will cover later. So onto the first point about how this would lead to the endangerment of the country on a practical scale, right? Because the reason that this country is currently in its shambling state is due to terrible leadership, dictatorship, abuse of power, etc., right? We can take a look at modern society with the Bong Bong Marcos and the likes, embezzling Malaysia's money and then going ahead and brainwashing people by saying, vote for me again, because I can change, I won't do it again. The future generation and family members are probably also heavily influenced by the previous dictator / incompetent ruler due to the fact of being in this ruling party for so long and in the government. They most likely have these relations and are influenced by their ideologies and beliefs. So why is this so detrimental? Well, the impact is dangerous to the country, I'll take later, if we let a member of the dictator to just come and pretty much embezzle things again, right? Even if it isn't the dictator themselves, and you might argue, the family members or potential other people ruling in the court are innocent. No, because they have been in the proximity of this ruler for so long to have the ruler affect them and influence them. And we think that especially in post-revolution countries, right? As aforementioned, people need an ideology to follow. So this is most likely just going to be Germany losing World War I and needing guidance. So they buy in any sort of olive branch that is offered, like Hitler making, Germany great again. And so we think this would definitely endanger the country in two ways. One, creating a situation where people blindly follow a leader. And secondly, potentially letting, a member come in that can be influenced from behind the scenes by the previous dictator and continue to embezzle the state's money, which the state cannot handle as it needs to prioritize rebuilding. Before I move on, I'll take the POI.
How is it that in proposition side of the house, it is likely that these people from previous regimes are likely to win sort of like elections and win popularity?
Okay, here's the thing, right? Obviously, the main dictator themselves are obviously not, just not going to get into position because the people hate them. But the situation is that many people might view the family members or, other members of the political regime as innocent or actually competent, because they could be just, politicians that hold political positions, and the people might have seen them as kind and benevolent. And so if these people were to run and they were to say, blame everything on the dictator and not take any part of it themselves, the people are pretty much likely to buy in, because as we already mentioned, once again, it's a post-conflict state and they need someone to believe in and trust in. So if some of these politicians have been kind to these people before, then they can come up here and stand, right? So with that point taken out, we'd like to move on to the point about less trust in the government and less opt-in. So what is the mechanism here? The situation is that the people have seen how terrible the previous government is, and they're not going to be happy with letting these people go ahead, right? Sure, we recognize your point about how they're most likely not going to be elected because they're not going to win, but it is at least suitable to place this precaution, because as we've already mentioned, we think family members do have a substantial chance of getting in and it being manipulated. And given this, the impact of, potentially voting or even letting them enter this election is that there's less opt-in from other countries, right? Because, for example, the US might see this small country have this dictator overthrown, and they'll be, okay, you're making progressions. But then once again, you offer them the chance to once again get voted. And even if they're not, the other countries will see probably that, they're not learning from their mistakes. They're repeating history, and there's going to be less opt-in and less investment in trying to help this country rebuild, right? For example, Afghanistan or something post-conflict, allowing the Taliban to run for president. The US is not going to be happy about that. And this is detrimental, as the burden is to try and rebuild this country to the best of our abilities. And having more opt-in from foreign countries is definitely extremely essential to that, right? And another micro point we like to offer is that practically there's less trust in the government from the people, which makes it impossible to pass policies and rebuild. Why? Because first of all, just by giving these terrible dictators and their family members and, fellow accomplices in the eyes of the people a chance to get back into the political spectrum and into the leadership position will lower the public order, because the people have spent so many years trying to, take them down or go against them, trying to get them out of power, and just offering them this chance is going to pretty much make the people lose all the trust in this new government that is forming from the ashes of the previous government. So it makes it impossible to pass policies and rebuild. And needless to say, if these people are actually voted in, then the people are going to offer no support, right? They're probably going to ditch. There's going to be revolutions, there's going to be graffiti. It's going to be extremely hard for the government to actually pacify and actually, pass any policies to rebuild. And thirdly, that leads us into a closely correlated point about the principle, right? We think it's unjust to put a country into a decade or more of turmoil, as they've just gone through that, and now you want them to go through that again. It is principle just spitting in the faces of those who have sacrificed their lives, spend time, whatnot, trying to defend their country and overthrow this dictator or this person who's bad for the country, right? You are essentially just discrediting their whole motive for trying to get the people out of power by allowing them a chance to be brought back into power. And we don't think it is right for you to do so. The impact of that, revolutionaries are probably just going to uprise again, and the public order, as aforementioned, is going to be very low. There will be no buying from any exterior countries. What if we told you today three pieces of substantive? We have met our metric in two practical ways by proving how essentially you're endangering the country again by allowing this regime to come once again into play. And secondly, you are losing trust in the government and opt-in, which is terrible for a country that's trying to rebuild. And third of all, principally, you are making things unjust. And it is due to this that I am so proud to propose. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. I would like to invite the leader of opposition. Whenever you're ready here.
Okay. My speech begins in 3, 2, 1. Panel, note that side proposition's case is entirely predicated on the fact that these people, these previous regime members might win, right? And because of that, I'm so proud to oppose, because their case falls based on this assumption. Why does that case fall? Why does that presumption fail as in the long term, right? Because we think that generally when you look at post-conflict states, they're right? People want to have a people to follow, they want stability, but the whole reason they have that wanting in the first place is because they overthrew a previous government. That means that there will be a solid and solidified majority of people against the previous regime, people who will vote against them, people who will vote for other political parties instead of them, right? We think that when you have this sort of majority, there's no chance in any way that these previous individuals will have a shot to actually win these elected positions, even if they still have followers that that love them and adore them, right? We think that simply because of the fact you have a simple majority, they will lose. But let's say even if, right? Let's be charitable. What if they do actually get some of the power? Firstly, we don't think there's going to be a substantial role. We don't think they're going to be able to get prime minister, president, or even some more substantial role. We think we're going to get more likely to get like a smaller seat, even if they do win. So if this means like one single seat in parliament, that is not likely to amass to anything because of the whole system of democracy, because you need to go through democratic principles. Two, we think that because of international pressure, we don't think, no thank you, if they do win these 0 seats, they will actually be able to amount to anything. because international countries will be looking at them, and because of that, they're not likely to do anything outrageous, right? Thirdly, we think that because even if they do get elected in something, they will not be able to do anything illegal because every eye is on them. They are part of a previous regime. People will be watching their every movement, will be auditing them every single second, and because of that, they won't be able to do anything illegal or rash that might harm the country in any way. Because of that, their case already automatically falls. No, thank you. But let's hand over the rest of their case, right? We say firstly, there's going to be less opt-in from other countries because of the fact that there will be turmoil, etc., right? But firstly, we think that when you look at democracy, when other countries, international countries, look at countries that limit democracy, like what's that proposition doing, that is when they don't want to buy in. When international countries buy in is when they believe in a system that works. But moreover, right, this is predicated on a premise that there will be bad impacts to these bad leaders running in office, which, as I'll later prove, will only happen on side proposition. Thirdly, they talk about how there's going to be less trust in the people, but we don't think this is the case because us side proposition beautifully characterized. They want a person to follow, meaning that they're less likely to distrust the government simply because they are allowed to run, right? Fourthly, we think they said it's unjust for these previous people's run because it would cause the country to be in turmoil. Or note that this is a utilitarian principle, meaning that as long as I prove to you today that there will be more significant impact to the country on side proposition, this principle goes to us. So now moving on to my two pieces of substantive. Firstly, on a principle of democracy, we think that when you don't let these people run, right, they still represent a proportion of people nonetheless that still deserve the right to vote, that deserve the right to speak out their opinions. So when you remove these people from being able to run for office, when you disallow them to do anything regarding the democratic principle, we think that these are generally just against the democratic principles that post-conflict states are trying to get to, right? They should have like a sort of way to vote, to voice out their opinions, and what side proposition is doing is neglecting that, right? We think that it's unique to removing like members of the previous regime and their families because of the fact that when you try to have other leaders or other people who try to run based on this sort of regime principle or like a previous regime stance, you don't get sort of that like say because people aren't aware who they exist, right? They only care about our previous regime members. The impact of this is not only is this against the principles of democracy, but you're also delegitimizing the post-conflict states for right? Because, and this I'll take it later. We find this to be very important because this is a country in its infancy, right? They will have critics, they will have people, world news will be focused on them. So when you delegitimize them, when you say, oh, democracy only important when we pick and choose different scenarios, that's giving a bad PR, that's giving bad light onto these countries, and it's delegitimizing their democratic principles. Because of that, we already went to this debate. But I'll take a POI before we move on to the second point.
Don't democracy only apply when you don't significantly affect others? For example, how prisoners can't.
Yeah, got it. So we think that when you say that democracy only applies when you don't affect others, that's covered. We think that it's perfect to cover our model, right? Which I was going to say later, right? Our model is that unless we think that people who have been found guilty of crimes or have significantly harmed the country that's being found guilty or even ongoing investigation, they of course cannot run, right? That's a basic principle of democracy that we will uphold as well in Outside House. Only people who have not been found to be guilty or involved in that should run. Otherwise, I think that's covered your POIs. Now moving on to my substantive, right? Firstly, on why we calm down tension on opposition and why tensions only ignite on prop. A few premises for proposition side, right? We think that firstly, both sides agree that they still have a following of the regime. Secondly, I think both sides can agree that these former leaders still reasonably want power, right? They're power hungry. They had a taste of power and they're itching for more, right? Because of the fact that they've been upended, they feel like they've been unjustly robbed, and because of that, they still want a way to get power. But then, if there is no democratic solution to this, what will they do? What we think is most likely on side proposition side of the world is that they will resort to violence. They will resort to, let's say, fear mongering, to rallying up their followers to make a separate state and become a warlord in that area, right? We're going to have territorial disputes. No, thank you. We're going to have that, and we're going to have violence within this country, even if it's not to the most severe extent. We think violence is still horrible for a post-conflict society because we've already gone through it, right? They need stability in a time like this, as side proposition pointed out. And when we incite violence, when you make sure that they do not have a way to regain power, all you're doing is inciting the flame and inciting the violence within it. We think that when you have on side proposition, that is innately harmful, and we do not want that. on side opposition, why do we make sure that there is no violence on our side, right? Because we think that when we open up the democratic principle, we create a clear path to power, right? And so these individuals will make a cost-benefit analysis in their head and say, oh, if I choose violence, it may not work. If I choose democracy, there's a clear-cut way for me to win, because if I just rally enough people to vote for me, right? So they're going to choose democracy every way. But then, when using this violence, we're using this anger from like the previous overthrow of the government, we're going to use that anger to instead rally up the people to vote for them, and not incite violence, not do all the things that happen in proposition, but instead try to vote for them in the polling booths. That's going to be the likely scenario on side opposition. So then, as I already proven to you, they will not win. But then afterwards, why will they still continue even if they do not win? Two layers, right? Firstly, if they lose by a lot, they know now that its violence is not a suitable option, because they do not have the manpower to seriously win and become a separate state. But if they lose by a little, say they have a 30% vote in margin, they will still continue going democracy. And we think that's how we deflame and reignite tensions on opposition side of the house. Because of all I've said today, I'm so proud to propose vote for side opposition.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. Give me 1 second. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2. Opposition really like to characterize the conflicted individuals of the previous regime as honest, genuine congressmen who try to get their stable views on the table of a fair diplomatic society that they envision. Now, this assumption from Op is exactly why their case is so internally flawed, and it's also why they lose this debate. Now, here's why. Op's case is first and foremost just an overlying contradiction. On one hand, they try and push that dictators holding any position of power have no mechanical power to do anything radical. Why? Because someone's looking over them 24/7. Now, if this was the case, how in the world do you think they got overthrown? Because they weren't looking at the other side? They weren't looking at the people trying to uprise them? Because they forgot? No, that's just not true. On top of this, their counterfactual is just completely illogical and contradicts their own case as well. On one hand, they say there's no way for the previous dictators to possibly try anything radical because they don't have enough power and someone's looking over their shoulder 24/7. Yet in the same speech, their counterfactual has these fallen tyrants using violence to get what they want. That sounds pretty radical to me. Now, the first mistake is their view on the intentions of the past regime's associates. We're talking about countries where the last power was so tyrannical to justify a regime. Their primary motivation in their minds will be to get back into power, and they will do whatever it takes. Under the table insurgencies, puppeteering, we both agree on this. They just underestimate their power to fulfill these flaws. Now, to clarify what we're not saying it's mutually exclusive, but it's just far more happened for these fallen tyrants to rise back into power on their side of the house, holding positions of political power, potentially military power. On Op's side, by even increasing this possibility, allowing them to run, the possibility to run is already worse than any harm on our side. Their second mistake is the incorrect assumption of the condition of these post-conflict states. Op are trying to frame these states as stable, working, democratic countries where every citizen has an exact solid view of exactly what they want. This is not the case. They've just been through a regime, immense political conflict, and it's so easy for the associates of the political party to frame themselves in a different light, to rally neutral or even the support of the other side. Think Germany after World War I, it speaks for itself. Hitler framed himself as a Democrat while his overlying views were obviously to gain power. He flipped the country upon itself. In fact, opposition tried to refute this in an outlandish POI to us in Prop 1 speech. And allowing to do so is just principally unjust. They put the country into a decade or more of turmoil by allowing the possibility of them to rise back into power. Opposition's counterfactual has the people of the fallen regime, the tyrants, using violence, even if we ignore the contradiction, using violence to get what they want. Yet, what is going to happen in both worlds, right? In their world, they add violence to what they want. In our world, they do so anyway, right? It happens in both worlds. Yet on their side, these people who are using violence have the increased political power. They have an increased seat in the Senate. Whereas our world, even in their best case scenario, they have no seat in the Senate. That's already less power for them in both cases. And again, remember, this is their best case scenario. We tell you that this is principally just spitting in the face of the insurgents who have sacrificed their lives, spent time and whatnot, trying to overthrow this dictator and this person who is terrible for the country. And then you just discredit their entire motive of trying to get people out of power by allowing the possibility of bringing them into power. Our case essentially takes us out of the situation, while they do nothing at all. Now, how do both worlds compare? On the short term, opposition multitudes the possibility of tyrants rallying back into power while the state is weak. Think Nazi World War I with Hitler. And in the long term, opposition allows the associates of the dictatorships to have their foot in the door. And as long as it's the case, our first speaker already mentioned this, it diminishes the country's reputation in the eyes of exterior countries who previously showed support, who now hold neutral positions, again, allowing them to far easily be swayed to the other side. It throws the value of a regime out the window, and for that, this motion stands. We do something, they do nothing. Proud to propose.
I would like to thank that speaker for their fine speech. I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition whenever you're ready. You're here.
I assume I'm audible because I was speaking earlier.
Yes, you are.
Proposition's second speaker's speech may have only been 3 minutes and 30 seconds long, but that was 3 minutes and 30 seconds enough to confuse all of us in this debate, right? Judge, I don't think you should trust them when they come up here and they try and spin us into a hole of contradictions. Judge, I think that what you have to do is you have to listen to me today and allow me to ground the debate as specifically as possible using, by taking down their case one by one. First of all, I'm going to start off by simply reinforcing the context that this debate is taking place in. Then I'm going to go and give you a full list of rebuttals, taking down their case bit by bit, even being charitable enough to give you even ifs. And then finally, I'm going to go and give you an extension about how you're unlikely to get international support in these post-conflict states should you have such an illegitimate democracy, right? So first of all, I just want to ground this debate. This debate takes precedence in post-conflict societies. First of all, note that this sort of motion implies the existence of an election, right? So automatically, we're already going to be talking about this idea of democracy. But second of all, right, I just want to say that it should be both teams' goal in this debate to create as legitimate of a democracy as possible. You want a legitimate democracy because, as my first speaker suggests, you want a democracy that's stable, one that people trust. I think that this is something that we are going to bring to you on our side of the debate today, right? But second of all, I'm going to talk about this more a bit later, but I think the examples that proposition side is first of all relying on, they shouldn't be relying on examples, but second of all, they're just not very good examples at all. I'll explain them in detail. First of all, I think what you need to understand, judges, is why these people are unlikely to get into power even when they're allowed to run in elections in the new states, right? We think that, first of all, quite clearly, it's because they're unpopular. They've been overthrown for a bloody reason, right? The people have seen the things that they've done. They see them as part of the party of culprits. They dislike them. We think that if proposition is going to suggest that these people are hated enough to cause distrust in the states when they are allowed to run for office, we think that arguably they're hated enough to not be able to win the bloody election, right? But second of all, we also think that this takes place in post-conflict society. We think that post-conflict societies, the crimes of the previous regimes are often exposed and the people find out the realities of these previous regimes and what they actually look like. Give an example, right? For example, let's talk about World War II. At the end of the war, none of the German population actually knew the real crimes of the Nazis and their concentration camps. However, once the war ended, once they transitioned to a post-conflict state, that's when everyone began to find out about the concentration camps, and they said, oh, goddamn, the Nazis were terrible people. This is what leads to these sorts of Nazis not being able to go into power again, right? Additionally, though, largely we just think that there's no sympathizers for these old regimes, for anyone associated with the old regime either, such as their families, right? We think that World War I is not an example that proposition can come up and bring here, right? Why did Hitler rise to power? Hitler did not rise to power because he was affiliated with the Kaiser. Hitler was no way affiliated with the people who were in charge before World War I. Instead, he rose in a power vacuum where there was no one able to take charge, right? We think that this isn't at all an example that proposition can use because it doesn't show why the people who have been affiliated with the old regime have risen to power. So we think that this argument means, therefore, that, first of all, proposition can have an argument where they say that there's no faith lost in the new state. But second of all, we think that there's no ability for these people to be causing damage in these new states. But even if, let me be more charitable than Santa on a 3-year-old's birthday, right? We think that once these people are in power, it's ineffective for them to be able to do horrible things. My first speaker already told you quite a bit about this, right? First of all, we have large parliaments. We have new democracies. We have many different steps and democratic layers in order to get a piece of legislation through. We think it's highly unlikely that they're able to push forward this kind of crappy stuff that proposition suggests, right? But secondly, we also think there
POI?
are international eyes on the conflict. They see this new state. They see a new state that could potentially be an ally to their country. We think that they see these sorts of new states, and after these conflicts, because of how big deal the conflicts have been, and all eyes are on them, we think that they want to see peace in these regions, and as a result, they are invested in making sure that, and as a result, these sorts of people are unlikely to do something wrong when the whole world is being highly judgmental and all eyes are on them, right? Let me give you an example. World War II. After World War II, nobody wanted a World War III where Nazism rose up again, right? So what Germany did is what the Allies did is they held the Nazis accountable. However, even though they did that, they still had many Nazis who were integral, many ex-German officials who were integral to building these sorts of new positions, who were in these new positions of power, who were building a new country, right? But what they did is they followed a policy of denazification. For example, they banned denial of the Holocaust. For example, they banned Nazi symbols in Germany. All these sorts of things are a process of denazification while holding the people who committed war crimes accountable to ensure that this new country was able to, even though it was built on these sorts of people of the old regime, it was able to grow and be the much better place that it is today. No World War III yet. Okay. But third of all, right, we also have this idea from proposition that there's faith lost in the new government for allowing these people to run. First of all, we think that the people who the population are specifically concerned with, aka those who have committed crimes in the old regime, they are probably going to be held accountable, right? Second of all, we think they're typically not going to be too concerned with the offspring of these people. However, we think that we've already told you, since they're unlikely to get into power, and these people know that they're unlikely to get into power because they're highly unpopular, we think that therefore they're not too worried when they start popping up in the polling booth and they get no votes, right? We think that last of all, though, what I just want to bring back what my first speaker said, which is this idea about how it's far more likely for people to not trust a democracy that picks and chooses the people that get to run in it, right? Because this tells people that when this democracy is picking and choosing who runs for it, this tells them that their party could be next. They could be the ones who are next to be outlawed by the democracy. We think that inherently it's far more likely on their side of the house for people to lose trust in democracy than in ours. We think that our democracy is inherently one that is better. Last of all, talking about their quick principle about no more instability, we think we co-opt this because we think on their side of the house, they lead to more instability, and that's something that we don't want. We think that their principle just reinforces why their case is so tragic, right? But last of all, let me talk quickly about international support for illegitimate democracies. Look, we think that other countries of the world and their investments are critical for development, right? We think it's critical for development, trade, international investment. All these sorts of things give these countries money to rebuild from the conflicts, right? We think this gives them the ability to stabilize too. And once people are stable, once people are roughly happy with the economy, we think that they're going to be roughly happy with their democracies too, taking you back to that argument about democracies, right? We think that, however, all of these sorts of international countries have standards for these investments. We think that, for example, this involves people joining the EU or NATO. They need to not have border clashes. They need to not have these sorts of unstable things. We think that it's similar in this sense, that there are some sort of standards for what the democracy looks like. We think there are standards for these international countries to look at these sorts of post-conflict societies and to say, okay, your democracy needs to be somewhat stable. You can't be doing this thing where you're picking and choosing, and as a result, we can't let you into the EU, we can't let you into NATO, etc., blah, blah, blah. We think that quite clearly, if they want this international support, they have to show that they're adhering to principles of democracy, etc. We think it's so important that you vote opposition in this debate. Thank you so much, Judge.
I would like to thank the speaker for their fine speech. I would like to invite the government whip whenever you're ready here.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll begin this speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition in this debate thinks that they can give people a chance to win when they know that they can't win. We refuse to give them a shot at winning. Therefore, we become the bad Santa. I think that with this being said, both sides probably don't want them to be the leader. So therefore, as long as we are able to take down opposition's cornerstone about democracy and how everyone has a shot to win, we win this debate. I don't really buy the elaborate BSing. As long as I can take down this principle, I prove to you that all of that stuff, the fancy elaborate things about history that Alex had told you, doesn't matter within this debate. A few pieces of framing in this debate before I begin and go into my clashes. Two things. One, will these people actually win? Well, we tell you that probably they aren't going to win. We agree with that. But at least when you give them this chance and then this shot to go into this election, they have a chance to win. For example, through methods such as brainwashing. This has already been successful to the extent that your own Malaysian government's leader, Bambang Marcos, is literally sitting in the throne as of right now. We tell you that it's uniquely bad when you give them this chance and platform to win, and this then takes down everything else the opposition might bring up because of how large this risk generally is. Two, you can't just go on and run some case about how because these people have been charged with war crimes, they can't run. For example, Bong Bong's family and him were charged with embezzlement. Thus, he still ran. We tell you that you can't just tell us that some people can run because that was your case, and opposition's top members, generals, family members, by the way, probably all have war crimes. Thus, they can't run on your side of the house. Opposition cannot just tell us that people can't run just because they have war crimes. We tell you that isn't part of this debate. In this debate, three clashes: one, under the principle of democracy; two, about who people will actually vote for; three, about whether they would want to choose violence. Under the first thing about the principle of democracy, three layers. One, democracy only applies when you don't have significant effects upon other people. For example, this is why prisoners, such as those within prisons, Alaska's prison, or those with mental disabilities cannot vote. We tell you that this is a parallel when we tell you that people within these spheres have significantly influenced the society within a negative way. Therefore, democracy takes away their right to vote, and this is a parallel which we think applies within today's debate. First layer of taking down the principle of democracy. Second, we tell you that even if this does fall, our principle about how we are then able to actually value the people's work who have worked hard to change the outcome outweighs anything that they can bring up. As long as we can prove, which we have within this debate, that there's a change within democracy, and we tell these people have worked hard to get these people out within legitimate ways of trying to overthrow them, we tell you that we already fulfill this principle by abiding by their wishes. By giving them a platform to do that, you already uniquely take down this principle where you value those who have tried to do this revolution and take these people down. Three, when you weigh this on a power of scale, even if we do go to the worst case scenario about how we have to sacrifice some form of democracy, as long as we tell you that this nuke, this ticking time bomb doesn't go off about these people coming into power, we still win. As long as we prove to you that there's a small minute chance of them getting into power and then blowing everything apart to cases, we are unwilling to take this risk. Second clash about who the people will vote for. Four things under this. One, I don't think that they will actually vote for these people, right? I think that this is something that's agreed on both sides of the house. I think the thing that they're not going to be voting for them is correct. But with that being said, they still have a chance, just like you guys. When you don't, just like you guys are winning this debate, I think you have a chance at winning this debate, though it's not likely, but it's still a chance, and we're not willing to take that. When they don't have anyone to follow, this is the only platform which you give them, which allows them to spew their narrative. We don't want to give them this chance. We tell you that they don't get this chance as long as we aren't willing to give them this platform to try and win this election. This then outweighs the principle of democracy on a practical scale, where we tell you that today, as long as there's a ticking time bomb that Alex Santa delivers to his 3-year-old child, this means that this is something that we should not do. Third thing under scrutiny that Alex presents, that the first Eric presents to you. Yeah, that's exactly why they won't invest in this development. I don't think that this is something the opposition can bring up about how this then doesn't apply in our case. That is why most of the times they won't want to join. But look what's happening to Bong Bong. Even though New York Times, CNN, whatnot, the whole Western media was upon them about how he's embezzling the funds, about how he's a dictator, about whatnot, Malaysian people probably didn't care. Most of the people voted for him, and now look, he's in office. We tell you that media scrutiny only applies to a certain extent, but when you go past that, it doesn't really matter. Therefore, when you have these people coming into power, you don't really get rid of any of this bad stuff that opposition tries to claim. Under the last clash of violence about how they choose violence, two responses to this. One, I think that they just don't even want to have power to go to violence anyways, when they literally, all their troops have already been wiped out. I don't see how they can choose violence on our side of the house in the first place. Second, why are they likely to choose violence on your side of the house? 4 unique layers under this. One, note that we agree with you on the fact that they probably won't get elected. But with that being said, they will probably try to get elected again. But then when they do try to get elected, they have some sort of people who support them because they're able to then get a platform on your side of the house to try and influence these people. We tell you that when they have these platforms, this is when they're uniquely able to get their message out to people in general and try to influence them. This means that then, because they know that they can't get enough influence because the people that they influence is a marginal minority, this means that they can get some sort of influence through other means outside of elections because they have this marginal power. Once they have this power, they're then likely to turn into violence because of violent insurgent groups. For example, the Black Panthers, jihadists, etc. We tell you that they are only able to do this on your side of the house, where you give them this platform to try and influence more people and get more people into their cult in the first place, which we tell you we aren't willing to risk at all within this debate. And because of that, we have proven to you in this debate, 1, we take down their principle. 2, we prove to you that there are much more important practical outcomes, as long as opposition cannot prove either 1, that the principle exists, 2, that the ticking time bomb is such an immense issue within this debate, we win this debate. They have to uniquely take down both to have a shot. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the speaker for the fine speech. I would like to invite the opposition whip whenever you're ready here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. My speech begins in 3, 2, 1. Seeing that this is a debate has basically evolved into a debate about definition and premises, let's argue with all the premises that have been brought into this debate and finally clear this up. Because what we have word for word from their first speaker is that they concede that it's unlikely for the people of the family to win a re-election, right? And yet they come up and say it's only as a precaution that we're going to implement this sort of model. And basically saying that's going to be, and it's basically an ineffective response brought by their first speaker, right? Because to tackle the whole premise that's brought by all 3 of their speakers and the benches, the conclusion is that their whole model is unnecessary. Because they've conceded these 2 premises, the grounds, it handles not only 1, the first 2 minutes of the second op speech, but they also fail to realize the bigger picture, which is that even if so, their best case scenario, which is they're unable to retain a good enough civil relationship between the civilians and the government, and 2, they hinder the future developments of post-conflict states, which are key in this debate. So number 1, what we see onto the response about short-term stability, which side can bring the best short-term stability in this debate, right? So what we see is number 1, the established premise, which we brought throughout my speakers as well, is that if the previous leader was criminal, atrocious, it's unlikely for the affected citizens to re-elect them, right? Both sides have established that. So what they have failed to engage with, and the focal point is number 1, preventing further discourse between the new regime and old regime. This is the case of bringing violence, which they brought very late into their last speaker. And what they basically brought is ultimately our whole response to their violence point is who's comparatively more likely to rebel and use violence at the very worst case on our side, right? An enraged dictator who's restricted from voting, from election, any sort of way of legitimate way of getting into power, they're more likely to go back to their old ways and their old proven methods in comparison to our side, where you bring them election with eligibility, which only can uniquely bring the specific international spotlight, which then leads to, again, the only way to achieve better development as a post-conflict state. And the main takeaway from this is number 1, on our side, we provide stability by preventing short-term civil discourse, and we also bring a new stance on enacting change through our model, right, where the power lies within the people's vote. This is the case of democracy and a complete pure democracy, and restricting the eligibility, which is the key point of this debate, of members of previous regime, taints that idea, taints that philosophy, and basically delegitimizes the post-conflict state and its further developments, which is the key point that they failed to acknowledge, right? So what we see on the comparative on their side is the results are you're more likely to have future retaliations, right? You're more likely to be delegitimized, and ultimately, right, what you have to see is that the stakeholder and the previous leader, right,
Very
there's two
convenient,
scenarios.
sir.
Number one, they either lose and they realize that the re-election is simply impossible, like they simply realize that violence is no longer an option on our side, or B, they also realize it's basically a lost cause, and they simply will comparatively have an unlikely chance to resort to the old methods of violence on our side, right? So let's move on to the point about withholding democratic values. Why is this the case? Because the context is, and the premises we must establish, is that post-conflict states aim to re-empower their political system, which has just been shattered by the conflicts, right? They aim to retain good civil relations to make sure that if the people are happy, then more likely developments will be much faster, much more efficient. So why is a non-restrictive democracy effective with our model for the political system? Number one, it's the fundamental philosophy of democracy, which is allowing all candidates to run. Again, we stated in our first speaker, if they're convicted, then we won't allow them to run, which will happen most likely on both sides. But again, this is the case where we're talking about the other side, the dictators who may be alleged of atrocities, etc. So our model is more likely to legitimize the post-conflict states because of this mech that we're going to bring, right? The new approach is equivalent to a new stance. On the surface level, it's a gesture to embrace civil empowerment, and on number two, it lays the foundation for future developments in the political system of the post-conflict society, right? The democracy, it basically betters international relations. That will be brought up in the third clash. And basically what we see about retaining a civil relation, again, is from their words of the second or first speaker. They say that people want hope in post-conflict societies, and we agree with that. But we flip this argument on the case and say that obviously then they're more likely to have a complete trust in a completely democratic system, seeing that they have just fallen to a regime, right? So what do we have on their side? What's the comparative? The stance shows regression, and on the surface level, the sort of restriction of candidates represents resorting to older regimes' past ways. This could be the stem of the problem. This is a risk that the future and Western societies who are wishing to fund post-conflict states are not wishing to take, fundamentally because of this sort of restricted democracy that they try to support. So the impact is civilians are going to be hurt. The country's development will be stalled, which is against the moral principle of why it should be justified and why it's effective in the first place. And what opposition cannot do, and they fail to do, is argue both sides about restricting candidates and picking and choosing, right? You basically contradict on proposition the democracy, the philosophy of democracy, and simply less appealing to the world and the fundings, which is crucial for the development in post-conflict societies, right? So how does this happen? How do you bring future development, which is a key point that they fail to basically engage with? And the context is, as a post-conflict society, you need successful reconstruction. What does this look like? Because you're a post-conflict society, you just endured war. Most likely, most of your economical and manpower resources have been used, right? They're depleted. So you need to basically achieve some level of economic bounce back, some level of economic surplus, and you can do so. And the most efficient way to do so is to maintain and re-achieve good diplomatic relations. So what are the takeaway from our side, right? The democracy and the whole model that we brought up about allowing these candidates and giving them their eligibility means that it's key to good international relations, right? Things, big actors such as the USA, even alliances such as the NATO are all notorious for backing fellow democratic countries which aren't restricting and contradicting to the philosophy of democracy itself. We are more likely on our side to get military and economical alliance of superpowers such as the US, which are key, the most efficient and effective way for these countries to redevelop and re-engage, which enables faster rebuilding. And ultimately, the external influence and funding from these good relations will obviously achieve and can continuously develop these post-conflict societies from a cultural standpoint, right? What we see ultimately is that, number one, they're on the second case of future development, is that they're more likely to have a better judicial system. And this is another key point that needs to be brought up from my first and second speakers, right? They're likely going to be more transparent because of this model, and in future ways, you re-legitimize criminal trials, and again, you can bring back investigations of the previous incompetent, or in this case, atrocious leaders, right? So what have we brought to you for the three classes in today's debate? Number one, we've shown that on our side, we're clearly able to achieve short-term stability. We prevent future retaliations, or at least comparatively are less likely to endure more civil violence. Number two, we've told how withholding democratic values are key to the future country's development, which is the whole point that has not been engaged by the other side. And for all these reasons, this is why the motion should absolutely stand.
I would like to thank that speaker for their fine speech. I would like to invite the opposition to try speaker whenever you're ready here.
Okay. My speech begins in 3, 2, 1. First and foremost, I would like to apologize to all the judges from Malaysia for my classmate and peer in government whip for assuming that Marcos is your leader, right? Because that just simply isn't true. But Marcos was actually a great example for our case as well because of a few things, right? Firstly, we think that when you look at Marcos and what he's done, when you look at his influence, their family's influence and their legacy and how it still got his son into office, when we think that there isn't a democratic way for him to express and use those votes in the first place, that significantly prove the violence that will happen on side proposition because of the fact that they have so much influence, because of the fact that they have so much power and so much influence over the people. They're likely to be able to create like a separate state, very likely to be able to create incite violence if it were not for the ballot booth. If it were not for like the ability to vote, we think that that would have the Philippines would have gone to a much worse part, right? But moreover, we think that when we compare our world on side opposition to what proposition proposed, we think it's still a much better case, right? Because even though, yes, sure, Marcos did win the Philippines election, but we think that was still done at least a bit democratically. That was still done with a few democratic principles, and we're still fine with him winning because he did it fairly. He did it without like doing military stuff, without inciting violence as well, right? On their side, we think that when they pick and choose democracy, that is not a good principle to stand on, right? When they pick and choose what they can actually do, we think that that is a principle line that is wary and does not work. And for those reasons, we already win today's debate. But moreover, let's look at the international relations side, which side proposition also does not work with. Firstly, let's talk about international relations on our side of the house. We told you about when we have a realm of democracy, when we uphold democratic principles on every side of the way, whether it's also allowing these former regime members to also run in these elections, we think that's a huge benefit, right? We think that still upholds the principles of democracy, and therefore, when other international countries look at it, they see that this country is still doing something. And when we've proven to you that these individuals will not win, these international relations would be even more confident and put even more money within this post-conflict state. Because of that, we get so much more support as well. What happens in opposition, or what happens outside of opposition that makes it so they have less international support? What we think is simply obvious, right? Ignoring the fact that there will be violence and therefore international countries will not want to touch these countries in the first place. But moreover, when they see this idea of democracy that has been picked and chosen, when we see this democracy that disallows individuals and disallows individuals of the states to also vote and express their opinions, when there is going to be critics about this new government as well, we think that is when you don't get the support you want on side opposition. And this is ignoring all the violence that will happen on their side of the house. When you have this sort of idea on side proposition, they're unlikely to get any stability at all because A, you don't get any international funding, you don't get any extra resources that is able to help stabilize the country in the short term as well. B, you get more violence, meaning that countries have to be citizens who already suffered through an insurrection, have to suffer through more and more painfulness that is also weakening a post-conflict state. And thirdly, even if they don't get violence on their side of the house, you still get madness. Like you still get people who are mad, who are angry, who support the old regime in the first place, who are trying to speak out and try to undermine the new government's change. On their side, they don't get any stability, and we think that is horrible for post-conflict states. Whereas in our world, we've proven to you today, firstly, about why the principle of democracy is still important because it delegitimizes the states. Secondly, about how this causes them, international states, to also give funding to them. And thirdly, about this idea of violence and how we get stability on our side of the house because we prove to you why these former regime members will choose democracy in the first place and why they will continue to choose democracy from as early as my LO speech. Because of all of this, because President proposition has not engaged and has not given a sufficient counter model for the world, I'm so proud to oppose.
I would like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. I'd like to invite the government reply speaker whenever you're ready here.
Thank you. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. Okay. I will start my speech in 3, 2. Opposition hammers a lot on the Nazi example, which is kind of funny because they seem to have misheard the example we raised. We're talking about how the Nazis first came into power. That was during a post-conflict period in Germany after World War I, a period of uprising. However, sure, they were held accountable after World War II ended, but that's because they were supported and managed to get their kicks in, something opposition side somehow also does not solve. They also seem to think that we shouldn't have brought up the Germany example, so in response, they base half their second speech on it as well. On top of this, they combat our entire case with, it's highly unlikely that it will happen, so we don't really need to do anything about it. You don't give a monkey a gun just because it's unlikely to find a bullet and shoot you, or else you get people like opposition. On top of this, they failed, and I'm assuming we're too scared to engage with our calling out on their contradictions as a whole. Nothing about it. They can't do anything radical, but they also use violence. They can't overthrow, yet they also got overthrown. These are black and white contradictions that they leave us really confused as to what they're actually trying to say here. Now, on to my speech. Opposition loses this debate on a couple of major assumptions. Number one, letting these members of the old regime run is a completely innocent and even good act. No, because essentially showing a backhanded forgiveness for these people and disregarding the fact that the revolutionaries spent years beating them back for a reason. And also, secondly, the assumption is that the revolutionaries will not get in no matter what. Why not? Bong Marcos was able to do it. We think that if you're so certain they won't get in, then why don't we take away the option for them to get in the first place? Their only argument against this is a contradiction to their own case. They have no reason whatsoever. Now onto the comparative. What's the principal argument about what's most important to democracy? They seem to think democracy is about anyone, anything. It's untrue. It's important to uphold democracy until it harms people. It's at the expense of the people's lives. That's when we should start discriminating. This is why if Kim Jong-un somehow found an American passport and ran for president in the US, he would probably be assassinated for tyrannical war crimes. No one will go, let's give him a chance. Let's give him a shot. Let's see what happens. You think it's any different if Kim Jong-un's brother got overthrown and then North Korea immediately let his brother run for president? Now onto the practical. The issue isn't that these dictators will win. The issue is that you're showing them forgiveness and you're showing them the opportunity by even giving them the platform to possibly win. You're throwing away the efforts of the revolutionaries in principle and all the deaths they sacrificed. The entire case falls on highly unlikely, whereas our case is a bulletproof situation. They fail to engage with our impacts at all, besides that they probably won't rise, so we don't really need to do anything. And finally, to nail in the coffin of this argumentative mess is their idea of international relations. They think that it'll be somehow they think it'll be more appealing for external countries to support these post-regime states if the members of the previous regime, the people that torture their people for lifetimes, are holding hands with the overthrowers, thinking it's a small world. This is ridiculous to even suggest. In fact, it's almost intuitive, and it's like purely logical that it actively harms the image of the new state if the members of the old are still sitting there in Senate, biding their time, waiting to strike once the state turns around for a split second. I don't see our opera being charitable at all when their idea of Santa is an old, weak, contradicted, messy argument. And for those reasons, this case stands. Thank you.
I would like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. With that, we have come to the end of all speeches for this round. Words will cross-shake across the house. I request the debaters to wait in the main hall for the result announcement and judges to stay back.